The corridor outside the West Gallery carried a regulated quiet. Climate control held the temperature steady, cool enough to keep the oil paintings preserved, cool enough that breath never lingered. The guard paused at the threshold where polished stone met the gallery's darker wood. His watch ticked once against his wrist, louder than it should have been. The escort window had opened 3 minutes earlier. That alone was not unusual. Children moved slowly through palaces, even when train schedules said otherwise. What was unusual was the light above camera West 3. It should have been green. It was dark. He shifted his stance, weight settling evenly through his boots. The open door ahead revealed only a slice of the gallery, a carved chair leg, a length of patterned carpet, the edge of a wall sconce glowing steadily. Nothing moved, no voices carried. The stillness felt arranged. His thumb pressed the control pad at his belt. The handheld display flickered to life. Camera West 3 showed a timestamp jump, 12 minutes unaccounted for, before resuming with an empty corridor. No error code, no system alert, just absence. He scrolled to the movement log. Personnel entries were sparse, as expected during a child transfer. 2 guards, 1 nanny, 1 supervising aide scheduled to meet them at the inner doors. The names were correct, the times were not. The aide's entry appeared 6 minutes before authorization had been issued. The system accepted it anyway. He did not react outwardly. Reaction was visible. Procedure demanded neutral posture. He checked the corridor behind him. Long, straight, clear to the bend near the eastern stair. No one approaching. Protocol offered options. He could halt, report a technical irregularity, request verification, and wait for confirmation. That would delay the transfer. Delays were logged, reviewed, questioned. He could also advance, secure the child, and flag the discrepancy afterward as a system's fault. That option kept the schedule intact. He rested his palm briefly against the doorframe. The wood was cool, recently polished. There should have been shoes on the mat inside. Children's escorts did not cross thresholds barefoot. The mat was empty. A faint sound reached him then, not a voice, not a footstep. Fabric shifting. He listened again. Nothing followed. He touched his radio once, a light tap rather than a full press, checking resistance. The camera indicator glowed. He pressed to speak. "West Corridor status check," he said, voice level, routine. Static answered him. Not full interference, just enough to swallow a reply. He released the button and waited a second longer than necessary. Training emphasized patience, but also momentum. He had learned to feel the difference between delay and hesitation. This was the latter. The missing camera time could be a maintenance error. The log entry could be clerical. The open door could be human forgetfulness. Each explanation fit alone. Together, they formed a pattern that did not belong in a child transfer. He adjusted his gloves, leather creasing softly. The corridor clock advanced another minute. Somewhere beyond the door, a schedule was continuing without him. He stepped forward, just enough that his shadow crossed the threshold and touched the gallery carpet. The sconce light caught the edge of his sleeve. He did not enter fully, not yet. His radio vibrated once, a false start. No voice followed. He looked again at the camera indicator on his display. The system would log his next movement, whether he liked it or not. Once he crossed the threshold, the decision would no longer be theoretical. He inhaled, slow and controlled, and reached for the door. The door moved without resistance. Its hinges were freshly oiled, silent by design. As it opened wider, the West Gallery revealed itself in measured segments, First the patterned runner, then the long bench beneath the tapestries, then the far wall where the inner doors stood closed. The lighting was unchanged. The air carried a faint citrus note from the morning polish. No people were visible. He stepped inside and let the door close behind him, not fully, leaving it ajar by habit. His boots made almost no sound on the carpet. He kept to the left, where the cameras, when functioning, favored visibility. He did not look up at the dark lens of West 3. He already knew it would show nothing. Halfway down the gallery he stopped again. A small object lay near the base of the bench, partially obscured by shadow. He crouched, careful not to touch it with his hands. It was a toy, wooden, hand-painted, worn smooth at the edges, a lion with one chipped ear. It did not belong on the floor. The child carried it everywhere. It was logged as part of the transfer kit, noted for its calming effect. If it had been set down, it should have been retrieved. He rose slowly, scanning the room. The inner doors remained closed. The handles were untouched, aligned perfectly. No marks, no scuffs. He checked the time again. 4 minutes past the escort window now. He keyed his radio once more. "Control, West Gallery irregularity," he said. He kept his tone precise. "Requesting confirmation on camera West 3 outage and aide clearance timestamp." This time the static lasted longer. Then a partial response cut in and out, unreadable. He released the button and did not try again. Repeated attempts would register as signal congestion, not urgency. He moved to the bench and placed himself between the toy and the rest of the gallery, an unconscious choice that training later would explain. He did not pick it up. Objects were evidence once they were out of place. Footsteps sounded beyond the inner doors, light, measured, not hurried. The doors opened inward, and a figure stepped through, one of the junior stewards, alone, empty-handed. "Escort already passed," the steward said, almost casually, as if answering an unasked question. His eyes flicked to the guard's belt, then away. The guard did not respond immediately. He watched the steward's posture, relaxed shoulders, neutral expression, too neutral. "Which route?" the guard asked. The steward gestured vaguely toward the northern corridor. "Standard adjustment. Instruction came down late." "From whom?" The question was simple. The answer should have been immediate. The steward hesitated, then named a senior aide, someone with enough authority that questioning them carried weight. The name matched the log entry that had appeared too early. The guard nodded once, as if accepting the explanation. He did not move aside. "There's a delay. Child item left behind." The steward glanced at the toy. His expression shifted just slightly. Calculation, not concern. "I'll inform them," the steward said. He made no move to pick it up. "That won't be necessary," the guard replied. "I'll handle it." Silence settled again, thicker now. The steward's radio crackled softly, then went quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, systems continued to function as designed, unaware of the narrow space where they had failed. The guard reached down and lifted the toy, holding it by the torso. It was warm, recently handled. He placed it carefully on the bench, in full view. "I need confirmation," he said, voice steady. "Until then, this corridor is closed." The steward's jaw tightened. He did not argue. He stepped back through the inner doors, leaving them open behind him. The guard remained where he was, alone with the quiet, the misplaced object, and a growing certainty that the gap in the schedule was not an accident. The northern corridor narrowed as it left the public galleries behind. The ceiling dropped by a fraction, just enough to change the acoustics. Sound traveled farther here, footsteps carrying before their source appeared. The guard moved at a measured pace, not rushing, not delaying. The toy remained on the bench behind him, logged mentally, untouched by anyone else. His radio stayed silent. He did not check it again. The corridor lights were set to evening mode, soft, indirect, designed to reduce glare on polished stone. Ahead, the passage bent left toward the private wing. That turn marked the boundary between ceremonial space and controlled access. Beyond it, escorts did not improvise. He slowed before the bend, listening. There it was again, fabric shifting, closer now. A child's breathing had a rhythm different from an adult's, lighter, uneven when unsettled. He heard it before he saw them. They emerged into view together. The senior aide walked briskly, posture upright, one hand clasped around the child's wrist, not guiding, holding. The child was half a step behind, shoes scuffing faintly with each stride. The aide did not look down. The guard stepped into the corridor, positioning himself squarely in their path. He did not raise his voice. "Hold," he said. The aide stopped immediately. Authority recognized authority. Her grip did not loosen. "This corridor is closed. Escort deviation not authorized." The aide's expression remained composed. She produced a slim card from her pocket, held it up without handing it over. The seal was correct. The clearance level was sufficient for certain actions at certain times. "We are late. The schedule has changed." "Not on my board," the guard replied. His eyes stayed on the child. The child's free hand was clenched around nothing, fingers curled too tightly. "The board will update. It always does." The child did not speak. Children in this palace were trained not to, but the training did not erase instinct. The child leaned subtly away from the aide, weight shifting back as if testing whether resistance would be noticed. The guard noticed. He adjusted his stance, widening it by a fraction, not aggressive, just immovable. "Release the child," he said. "I'll confirm." "That won't be necessary," the aide replied. Her tone was calm, practiced. "You are delaying a direct instruction." "Then it can wait 30 seconds. Protocol allows for verification during child movement." The aide's eyes hardened. "You are overstepping." The guard did not respond to that. He focused instead on details. The aide's grip was too high on the wrist, restricting movement. The child's breathing was shallow. No visible injury, no tears. Distress did not require either. He keyed his radio again. This time nothing happened at all. No static, no vibration. Dead. The aide noticed the motion. A flicker of something, perhaps impatience, crossed her face. She shifted her grip and took a step forward, attempting to move past him. The guard moved with her, blocking the path without touching either of them. "Last request," he said, quietly. "Release the child." For a moment no one spoke. The corridor lights hummed faintly overhead. Somewhere, far off, a door closed, echoing once. The aide tightened her hold instead of loosening it. The change in pressure was slight, but unmistakable. The child's shoulder rose as the aide pulled, testing whether momentum would carry them past the obstacle in front of her. It did not. The guard's position held, balanced and deliberate, his boots anchored against the stone. "Step aside," the aide said. Her voice was still even, but the softness had gone from it. "You are creating an incident." "No, I'm preventing one." He raised his left hand, palm open, not toward the aide, but toward the child,
close enough to be seen, far enough not to intrude. A signal, taught quietly during specialist briefings. You are not alone. Stay where you are. The child's eyes lifted for the first time. They did not meet his directly. They fixed on his shoulder, on the insignia stitched there. Recognition passed through the child's face, brief but real. The tension in the small frame shifted, not easing, but redirecting, away from panic, toward stillness. The aide noticed that too. "You're misreading the situation," she said. "The child is upset because you've interrupted." "Children show distress differently," the guard answered. "This one has stopped resisting. That proves nothing. It proves enough to pause." The aide exhaled through her nose, a controlled release. "I have clearance," she said again, as if repetition could substitute for alignment. "I answer to people above you." "So do I," the guard said. He did not elaborate. In palaces, hierarchies overlapped. Guards answered upward through command, not influence. That distinction was often tested quietly in corridors like this. The aide attempted a different angle. She leaned slightly toward him, lowering her voice. "You don't want your name attached to a delay involving the child. These things are remembered." The guard felt the pressure register, not fear, but awareness. Reports followed names. Names followed careers. He acknowledged the reality without letting him move him. "I will file whatever report is required. So will you." Her grip tightened again, this time reflexively. The child flinched, just enough that the movement registered as involuntary. The guard stepped forward in the same instant. "Release," he said. The word was no longer a request. The aide's eyes flicked down to his hands. He had not touched her. He had not touched the child, but his body now occupied the space where her next step would have gone. The corridor no longer belonged to her. "This is inappropriate," she said. "So is force," he replied. For a long second nothing happened. The hum of the lights filled the silence. The aide's jaw worked once, then stilled. Slowly, deliberately, she loosened her fingers. The child's wrist slipped free. The guard shifted immediately, placing himself between them, his body angled to shield without enclosing. He lowered himself slightly, bringing his height closer to the child's line of sight without kneeling. "Stand here," he said quietly, indicating the space behind him with a subtle motion of his hand. The child obeyed at once. The aide straightened, smoothing her sleeve where it had creased. Composure returned like a mask being reset. "You have made a serious error," she said. "Then it will be documented," the guard answered. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor now, heavier, faster. Response teams moved quickly once momentum broke. The aide heard them too. Her gaze shifted past him, calculating exits that no longer mattered. The guard did not look away from her until the sound grew close enough to confirm backup. Only then did he glance down, checking the child's posture, breathing, balance, all intact. When he looked up again, the aide was already stepping back, her authority retreating into silence. The response team arrived without ceremony. 2 guards, 1 supervisor. Their presence altered the corridor's temperature more than its sound. Authority redistributed itself quietly through stance and spacing rather than speech. The aide stepped aside as they approached, already repositioning her account in her mind. The guard gave a brief, factual summary, times, locations, actions taken. He did not speculate. He did not accuse. The supervisor listened without interruption, eyes moving between the child, the aide, and the corridor behind them. "Take the child to holding 2, said the supervisor at last. "Standard pace." The guard nodded. He did not reach for the child. He waited. After a moment's hesitation, the child stepped toward him instead, small shoes tapping once against the stone. He adjusted his stride to match theirs, slower than regulation, but not enough to draw comment. As they walked, the corridor sounds returned in fragments, the distant click of a closing door, the low murmur of voices filtering through walls built to carry whispers. The child's breathing steadied after a few steps. No tears came. Relief rarely announced itself. Holding two was a small antechamber with no windows and a single bench fixed to the wall. Neutral space, no portraits, no symbols. The guard positioned himself by the door while the supervisor checked the room, then withdrew, leaving them alone with a junior attendant stationed outside. The guard remained standing. He did not speak. Silence was safer than reassurance. Reassurance invited questions he could not answer. The child sat, feet not quite touching the floor. After a moment, they rubbed at the wrist that had been held. The skin showed a faint red band, already fading. The guard noted it without comment. Beyond the door, voices rose and fell. The aide was explaining now. Her tone carried confidence, but the words, what little filtered through, did not align. Urgency without cause, authorization without sequence, each phrase correct on its own, but assembled poorly. The guard listened without appearing to. This was not interrogation, it was pattern recognition. He replayed the corridor encounter in his mind, not as a narrative, but as a series of observable facts. The aide had not asked for assistance. She had not acknowledged the child directly. She had defaulted to hierarchy rather than explanation. None of these violated protocol explicitly. Together, they indicated misuse. The radio at his belt vibrated once, then again. He lifted it, shielding the motion from the child's view. "Proceed to statement room," the supervisor's voice said. "You're needed." The guard acknowledged and clipped the radio back in place. He glanced at the child. The attendant outside would remain. Procedure covered that. Still, he hesitated for half a second longer than required. The child looked up at him then, eyes searching, not fearful but assessing. Children in this palace learned to read uniforms early. The guard met the look briefly and inclined his head, not reassurance, not promise, presence. He left the room. The statement room was larger, brighter, a table, 3 chairs, recording equipment recessed into the wall. The aide sat already, posture perfect, hands folded. She smiled faintly when he entered, as if greeting a colleague delayed by traffic. "This is being blown out of proportion," she said, before anyone asked a question. The supervisor did not respond to that. He gestured for the guard to sit. As the first formal question was asked, the aide began to answer, and the guard felt it again, that same quiet misalignment. The words were fluent, the timing was wrong. He focused on that feeling, cataloguing it carefully. In this room, instinct needed structure if it was to matter. The aide spoke at length without being prompted. Her account flowed smoothly, each sentence polished, each justification placed where it would sound reasonable to an inattentive ear. She described a last-minute adjustment, a concern raised elsewhere, a need for discretion. She named offices, not people, processes, not decisions. The supervisor let her continue. He did not interrupt, neither did the guard. Silence encouraged completion. When she finished, the room settled into a brief stillness. The recording equipment's indicator light remained steady. The supervisor glanced down at his notes, then up again. "You said the instruction came verbally," he said. "Yes," the aide replied at once. "That is not unusual." "No," the supervisor agreed, "but it is unusual during child movement." The aide smiled again, thinly. Circumstances change. The guard watched her hands. They were still folded, but the thumbs moved against each other, slow and repetitive. Not nervousness, control. "Who issued the verbal instruction?" the supervisor asked. The aide named a title this time, not a person. High enough to discourage follow-up, broad enough to resist verification. The guard noted the shift. Words adjusted to pressure, but the structure weakened. "When did you receive it?" the supervisor continued. "Minutes before the escort. There was no time for paperwork." The guard spoke then, his voice level. "The log shows your clearance registered 6 minutes before authorization was issued." The aide turned to him, surprised just enough to be genuine. "Systems aren't perfect." "No," the guard agreed, "but they are sequential." The supervisor leaned back slightly. "Camera West 3 was offline for 12 minutes, coinciding with your movement. That camera has had issues before. Maintenance can confirm." "They can," the supervisor replied. "They already have. No maintenance was scheduled." The aide's expression did not change, but the smile disappeared. She uncrossed her hands and placed them flat on the table. "You're constructing intent where there is none. I acted to protect the child." The guard did not respond immediately. He chose his words with care. "You did not address the child once. You did not ask for compliance. You applied force first. It was minimal and necessary. Children under stress comply when spoken to. This one withdrew." The supervisor nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The aide exhaled longer this time. "You're reading too much into behavior. Behavior is all we have." Another silence followed. This one carried weight. Outside the room, footsteps passed, paused, moved on. The palace continued to function, unaware of the narrow inquiry unfolding inside it. The supervisor closed his folder. "Will suspend your access pending review," he said to the aide, "effective immediately." Her eyes widened just slightly. "You don't have that authority." "I do," he replied, "in matters involving child safety." She stood, smoothing her jacket. "This will be addressed." "I expect it will," the supervisor said. She left without another word. When the door closed, the supervisor turned to the guard. "You'll file a full report, detailed, objective." "Yes, sir." "You'll have questions." "Yes, sir." The supervisor studied him for a moment longer. "You acted within your discretion," he said finally. "That doesn't mean it will be received that way." The guard acknowledged without comment. When he returned to holding to, the child was standing now, the attendant kneeling to speak softly. The child looked up as he entered. The guard stopped just inside the door. "It's over," the attendant said quietly. The guard looked at the child's posture, the steadier breathing, the absence of tension in the shoulders. He nodded once. For now it was. The corridor outside Holding 2 felt narrower than before. Not physically, its dimensions were unchanged, but procedurally. Every movement now existed inside a record that had already begun to circulate. The guard was aware of it in the way he adjusted his pace, in the precision with which he aligned himself to the right side of the passage. Nothing hurried, nothing casual. The supervisor walked beside him in silence. They did not discuss what had just occurred. Debriefing came later, in rooms designed for it. For now, the palace required continuity. At the junction near the service lift, the supervisor stopped. "You'll remain on internal rotation," he said. "No public-facing duty until further notice." "Yes, sir." "That's not punitive,"
the supervisor added after a pause. It's containment. The guard acknowledged the distinction. Containment protected institutions as much as individuals. The supervisor continued on alone. The guard turned back toward the inner wing, following the route assigned to him moments earlier. The radio at his belt was silent again. Not dead, he checked that, but constrained, as if traffic were being managed elsewhere. The internal rotation corridor was warmer, less airflow, less foot traffic. Walls without ornamentation. This was where things were kept moving when disruption occurred in the visible spaces. He had worked these corridors before, though never under these conditions. Halfway down the passage, his radio vibrated sharply. "Position check," a voice said. "Not control, different channel, senior operations." "Internal rotation corridor, proceeding as assigned." A brief pause. "Hold position." He stopped at once. "Explain your decision to intervene," the voice said. "No preamble, no accusation, just request." He answered the same way he had in the statement room, facts only. The open door, the camera outage, the log discrepancy, the physical handling of the child. He did not mention instinct. Instinct was not defensible. Another pause followed, longer this time. "You understand," the voice said carefully, "that deviation from escort authority can be interpreted as obstruction." "Yes," the guard replied. "And you proceeded anyway." "Yes." "Why?" The guard stood still, eyes on the blank wall in front of him. He chose his words as he had before, aligning them with observable reality. The indicators did not align. Child safety protocol allows intervention under those conditions. Silence again. Somewhere that answer was being weighed against other considerations the guard would never be privy to. "Remain where you are," the voice said at last. "Do not engage further unless directed." "Yes, sir." The channel closed. The guard did not move. He adjusted his stance to reduce strain. Waiting was also a task. From where he stood, he could hear distant movement, doors opening and closing, muted conversation carried through vents, life continuing around a disruption that had not yet resolved. He considered briefly the possibility that this would end poorly for him. Careers often did when lines were crossed, even for defensible reasons. The thought did not alter his posture. After several minutes, footsteps approached from behind, measured, confident. He did not turn until the sound was close enough to confirm rank. "Guard, walk with me," a familiar voice said. He complied. They moved together toward a side office, one used for operational adjustments rather than formal discipline. The door closed behind them with a soft seal. Inside, the lighting was subdued. A single desk, 2 chairs, no recording equipment visible. "This situation isn't finished, and it may not resolve in your favor. I understand. You did the right thing. That doesn't mean it will be protected." The guard nodded once. Outside the office, somewhere deeper in the palace, authority was reasserting itself. The question was how much pressure it would apply, and to whom. The senior officer did not sit. He remained standing near the desk, hands resting lightly on its edge, posture suggesting conversation rather than command. The guard took the chair only after a brief pause, aligning himself squarely, back straight, feet flat. He did not remove his gloves. "There are competing narratives forming," the officer said. "One is procedural, the other is political." The guard listened. "The procedural narrative supports your actions," the officer continued. "Irregular access, camera outage, unlogged deviation, physical handling of a minor, all defensible triggers." "And the other?" the guard asked.
The other says you disrupted a senior aide acting under implied authority, the officer said. That narrative is louder. The guard absorbed that without visible reaction. You should understand the risk, the officer added. Not immediate, longer term, subtle. Yes, sir. The officer studied him for a moment. If asked again why you intervened, he said, you will answer the same way. Yes, sir. Good. The officer straightened and gestured toward the door. Return to holding rotation. You're not cleared for external movement until review concludes. The guard stood and exited without comment. The holding rotation placed him near the child again, though separated by procedure. He did not enter the room. He remained outside, stationed at an angle that allowed visibility without intrusion. The attendant inside moved calmly, offering water, adjusting the child's jacket. No questions were asked. Time passed unevenly. He marked it by changes in ambient sound, the shift of ventilation cycles, the distant call of bells signaling internal transitions, the foot traffic ebbing and flowing as palace routines adapted around the disruption. At one point, the child looked toward the door. The guard remained still. After a moment, the child returned attention to the attendant. That was enough. His radio vibrated again. Update, Senior Operations said. Access review has expanded. Additional discrepancies identified. The guard acknowledged. Stand by. He did. Minutes later, another transmission followed. You are cleared to escort the child to the family wing. Supervisor will meet you en route. The guard entered the room then. He kept his movements slow, predictable. The child rose without being prompted, stepping toward him. He adjusted his pace to match theirs, maintaining a respectful distance, positioning himself as a barrier rather than a guide. As they moved through the corridor, the palace felt different, quieter, as if aware of itself. The supervisor met them at the junction, nodding once. No words were exchanged. They continued. When they reached the secure threshold, the guard stopped. He did not cross it. That boundary belonged to others. The child turned once more, looking up at him. The guard inclined his head, again the same small gesture as before. No promises, just acknowledgement. The doors closed. The guard remained where he was for a few seconds longer than required, then turned back toward his assigned post. Reports still needed filing, reviews still loomed. Consequences would follow, shaped by forces beyond his control. But the immediate task was complete, and for now, that was enough. The report room was colder than the corridors, not by design but by neglect. Air pooled there longer than elsewhere, a side effect of ducts routed around more important spaces. The guard took his seat at the narrow desk and activated the terminal. The screen brightened without sound. He began where procedure required him to begin. Time, location, assignment code. Each entry pulled him back through the sequence again, but he kept the narration linear, restrained. Reports were not stories, they were structures. Halfway through the initial timeline, the door opened behind him. He did not turn immediately. Footsteps alone were not sufficient cause. But when the chair opposite scraped softly against the floor, he looked up. The aide sat down without invitation. Her access badge was gone. The absence was deliberate, a visible marker of changed status. She folded her hands on the desk, mirroring the posture she had used earlier, though the confidence behind it had thinned. "You're writing this as if it's finished," she said. "It's ongoing," the guard replied. His eyes returned to the screen. She watched him type for a moment. the room filled with the soft sound of keys, the steady cadence of someone accustomed to precision. "You know what happens next," she said. "Statements escalate. Reviews expand. People look for balance." The guard continued typing. "There will be pressure," she added, "on how events are characterized." He paused then, not because of her words, but because the next field required a classification. He selected physical interference, yes. He did not add qualifiers. "That classification matters," the aide said, noting the change on the screen. "It implies intent." "It reflects action," the guard replied. She leaned forward slightly. "You could have stepped aside." "Yes," he said. "And you chose not to." "Yes." Her fingers tightened together. "You understand how this will be framed." He saved the entry and moved to the next section. "I understand how it might be attempted." Silence settled between them. The aide's composure shifted again, not to anger, but to something more precise. "The child will not corroborate you," she said. "They are trained not to." "That's not my concern," the guard replied. "It should be," she said. "You intervened without instruction, without confirmation. You placed yourself between authority and outcome." The guard turned in his chair then, facing her fully for the first time. His expression remained neutral. "I placed myself between force and a child. That is the outcome." For a moment the aide said nothing. The hum of the terminal filled the space where her reply should have been. "You've made enemies," she said. "Not a threat, a statement." The guard inclined his head slightly. Acknowledgement, not agreement. The aide stood. "This won't end here." "No, it won't." She left the room without another word. The guard returned to the report. His pulse was steady. He completed the remaining fields with care, attaching logs, timestamps, system anomalies. When he finished, he submitted the file and logged out. As he stood, his radio vibrated once more. "Guard," Senior Operations said, "we need you in interview." He acknowledged and moved toward the door. Behind him, somewhere in the system he had just fed, lines were being drawn more clearly now, between protocol that bent and a moment where it had broken. He stepped into the corridor, aware that the next room would demand more than facts. It would demand resolve. The interview room was smaller than the report room and warmer, the air heavy with the faint scent of old paper and recycled heat. A single table occupied the center, 2 chairs on one side, 1 on the other. The imbalance was intentional. The guard took the lone chair. Across from him sat 2 officials from internal review. Neither wore uniforms. Their attire was deliberately neutral, designed to separate authority from visibility. One activated the recorder. The other folded his hands and waited. "State your understanding of why you're here," said the first official. "To clarify my actions during the corridor incident," the guard replied. They asked him to recount the sequence again. He did, slowly, precisely, no embellishment. When they pressed for interpretation, he returned to observation. When they hinted at implication, he returned to timing. "You understood that the aide outranked you," the second official said. "Yes." "And you understood that intervening could be construed as insubordination." "Yes." "Then why proceed?" The guard answered as he had before. The indicators met threshold for child safety intervention. They exchanged a glance, not disagreement, assessment. "You could have waited for confirmation," the first official said. "I attempted contact. The channel failed. You could have allowed the movement to continue and reported afterward. Yes. But you didn't." "No."
Silence followed. The recorder's light blinked steadily. "Describe the moment you decided to block the corridor," the second official said. The guard paused, not to reconsider, but to choose accuracy. "When the aide applied increased force after being instructed to hold," he said. "At that point, delay increased risk." "Risk of what?" the first official asked. "Escalation, loss of control, psychological harm." The second official leaned back slightly. "That's a subjective assessment." "It is," the guard agreed, "based on training and observation." More silence. The questions continued, circling the same axis from different angles: authority, discretion, precedent. The guard remained consistent. Consistency was his defense. At last, the recorder was switched off. "This concludes the formal portion," the first official said. "You'll be notified of any further requirements." The guard stood. He did not ask what came next. Outcomes were not negotiated in that room. When he stepped back into the corridor, the palace felt quieter again, as if the earlier tension had been absorbed into its walls. He returned to duty on internal rotation, assigned to a passage that saw little traffic. Time passed. Meals were skipped without comment. Shifts adjusted around him. Late in the evening, his radio vibrated. "Access review complete," Senior Operations said. "Findings forwarded." The guard acknowledged. "Your report was instrumental," the voice added. "That is all." The channel closed. He remained at his post until relieved. When he finally removed his gloves, the indentations remained on his hands longer than usual. Elsewhere in the palace, decisions were being formalized, consequences assigned, authority redistributed quietly, without announcements. The guard did not know what shape those consequences would take. He only knew that when the line had been crossed, when force had replaced instruction, he had stepped where he was trained to step. Protocol had bent around him and held. The response team arrived without ceremony. 2 guards, 1 supervisor. Their presence altered the corridor's temperature more than its sound. Authority redistributed itself quietly through stance and spacing rather than speech. The aide stepped aside as they approached, already repositioning her account in her mind. The guard gave a brief, factual summary: times, locations, actions taken. He did not speculate. He did not accuse. The supervisor listened without interruption, eyes moving between the child, the aide, and the corridor behind them. "Take the child to holding 2, said the supervisor at last. "Standard pace." The guard nodded. He did not reach for the child. He waited. After a moment's hesitation, the child stepped toward him instead, small shoes tapping once against the stone. He adjusted his stride to match theirs, slower than regulation, but not enough to draw comment. As they walked, the corridor sounds returned in fragments: the distant click of a closing door, the low murmur of voices filtering through walls built to carry whispers. The child's breathing steadied after a few steps. No tears came. Relief rarely announced itself. Holding 2 was a small antechamber with no windows and a single bench fixed to the wall. Neutral space, no portraits, no symbols. The guard positioned himself by the door while the supervisor checked the room, then withdrew, leaving them alone with a junior attendant stationed outside. The guard remained standing. He did not speak. Silence was safer than reassurance. Reassurance invited questions he could not answer. The child sat, feet not quite touching the floor. After a moment, they rubbed at the wrist that had been held. The skin showed a faint red band, already fading.
The guard noted it without comment. Beyond the door, voices rose and fell. The aide was explaining now. Her tone carried confidence, but the words, what little filtered through, did not align. Urgency without cause, authorization without sequence, each phrase correct on its own, but assembled poorly. The guard listened without appearing to. This was not interrogation, it was pattern recognition. He replayed the corridor encounter in his mind, not as a narrative, but as a series of observable facts. The aide had not asked for assistance. She had not acknowledged the child directly. She had defaulted to hierarchy rather than explanation. None of these violated protocol explicitly. Together, they indicated misuse. The radio at his belt vibrated once, then again. He lifted it, shielding the motion from the child's view. "Proceed to statement room," the supervisor's voice said. "You're needed." The guard acknowledged and clipped the radio back in place. He glanced at the child. The attendant outside would remain. Procedure covered that. Still, he hesitated for half a second longer than required. The child looked up at him then, eyes searching, not fearful but assessing. Children in this palace learned to read uniforms early. The guard met the look briefly and inclined his head, not reassurance, not promise, presence. He left the room. The statement room was larger, brighter, a table, 3 chairs, recording equipment recessed into the wall. The aide sat already, posture perfect, hands folded. She smiled faintly when he entered, as if greeting a colleague delayed by traffic. "This is being blown out of proportion," she said, before anyone asked a question. The supervisor did not respond to that. He gestured for the guard to sit. As the first formal question was asked, the aide began to answer, and the guard felt it again, that same quiet misalignment. The words were fluent, the timing was wrong. He focused on that feeling, cataloguing it carefully. In this room, instinct needed structure if it was to matter. By the time the guard returned to the upper levels, the atmosphere had shifted again. Not abruptly, subtly. Doors that usually opened without pause now required confirmation. Faces he passed registered him with slightly more attention than before. His presence had acquired context. He was summoned before he reached his assigned post. The room was not labeled. It never was. It sat between offices, accessible only through a corridor that did not appear on public schematics. Inside, 3 people waited. One he recognized from senior operations. The other 2 he did not. That, in itself, was information. The logbook was projected on the wall behind them. Not the edited version, the original. "You've seen this," one of the unfamiliar officials said. It was not a question. "Yes," the guard replied. "Your intervention preserved it," the official continued. "Had the movement completed, the override would have been reconciled later, quietly." The guard remained still. The aide acted with expectation, the senior operations officer added. Not impulse. She expected compliance. She expected the system to absorb the deviation. And it usually would. That's why it's effective. The guard understood. Systems failed not because they were weak, but because they were trusted to self-correct. "There is no indication the child was being removed from the palace," the senior officer said. "This was not an abduction." "No," the guard agreed. "It was a test." The room went quiet. "A demonstration," the unfamiliar official said, "of how far access could be stretched without challenge." "And of who would challenge it," the other added. The guard felt that settle. His role in this had already expanded beyond the corridor. "The aide will be reassigned," senior operations said, "officially for procedural misjudgment." "And unofficially?" the guard asked. "Her access will never be the same," came the reply. The projection shifted. Another set of entries appeared, older, less dramatic, minor overrides, small timing corrections, always administrative, always unchallenged. This pattern doesn't start today, it ends today. The guard was dismissed without ceremony. When he returned to duty, the palace felt restored to itself. Schedules resumed, escorts moved with renewed visibility, cameras glowed green where they should. The child's transfer protocols were amended quietly, reinforced where they had been assumed. Late in the evening, as his shift wound down, the guard passed the West Gallery again. The door was closed. The mat held shoes, properly aligned. Camera West 3 hummed softly, its indicator steady. He paused only briefly. What had been uncovered would ripple outward, touching officers and individuals who would never know his name. That was how it was meant to work. When his replacement arrived, the guard handed over without comment. He removed his gloves, secured his equipment, and logged out. As he left the palace, the night air felt colder than he expected, not uncomfortable, clarifying. The truth had not needed him to speak loudly. It had needed him to stop walking. The family wing resumed its rhythm quietly. There were no announcements, no visible recalibration. That absence was intentional. Stability in a palace was measured by what did not draw attention. The guard returned to standard duty 2 days later. No explanation accompanied the reassignment. His name appeared on the roster where it always had, his shift unchanged. If there were notes attached to his file, they were not shared. That, too, was procedure. His first escort after the incident involved a different child, a different route. The protocols were tighter now. Additional verification steps inserted where assumption had once been enough. Cameras lingered longer at thresholds. Escorts paused where they previously flowed through. No one commented on the changes. They behaved as if it had always been this way. The guard noticed. He passed the family wing once during the afternoon cycle. The door remained closed. The guard detail posted there had been rotated. New faces, alert posture. Containment through renewal. He did not slow. Later, in a smaller corridor near the administrative stair, he encountered the supervisor who had first backed his intervention. The man acknowledged him with a nod, no more. "Your report closed the loop," the supervisor said quietly as they passed. "Yes, sir." "That doesn't mean it won't echo." The guard understood. Echoes were not his concern. His task was proximity, not outcome. Near the end of his shift, he was assigned to observe a routine child movement from a distance, not escort, not control, just presence. He stood near the wall as the group passed, watching details, hand placement, pace, spacing. The child walked freely, unrestrained, toy in hand. A different toy. The lion had been removed from circulation. Objects, like access, were sometimes retired without explanation. The child did not look at him. That was acceptable. When the movement completed, the corridor emptied again. The guard remained at post until relieved. No further instructions came. At home that night, he removed his uniform slowly, methodically. He folded it with the same care he used on duty. Muscle memory did not switch off easily. The imprint of the gloves remained faintly on his hands. Sleep came late. In the days that followed, references to the incident diminished. The aide's name was no longer spoken. Her office light remained dark. Administrative functions redistributed themselves as institutions always did, filling absences without acknowledging cause. The guard filed no further statements. None were requested. One afternoon, while standing watch near the West Gallery, he noticed a small adjustment, a new line painted into the floor's pattern, barely visible, guiding foot traffic more precisely through the space, a correction embedded in design. He recognized it for what it was. The palace learned in layers. As his shift ended, he paused briefly at the threshold where the door had once stood open by 4 inches. It was sealed now, as it should be. He did not touch it. He turned away and moved on. Weeks passed without incident. That, more than anything else, confirmed the outcome. Palaces did not announce resolutions, they absorbed them. The guard continued his rotations, public and internal, ceremonial and unseen. His name surfaced occasionally in briefings, never lingered on. That balance was deliberate. He noticed changes others might not. A second verification officer now appeared at child transfer thresholds. Escort timings were staggered by minutes, not for efficiency, but for observation. Administrative clearances required dual acknowledgement where one had sufficed before. None of it was framed as response, it was framed as refinement. On a quiet morning shift, he was assigned again near the family wing. Not inside it, near it. Proximity without implication. He took his position and stood at ease, eyes forward, senses open. A small group approached from the inner corridor, not a formal escort, a routine movement. The child walked between 2 attendants, unhurried. Their posture was relaxed, unforced. The guard watched the child's hands, empty, swinging freely at their sides, no restraint, no correction. As they passed, the child glanced up, not at him directly, but at the uniform. The glance held for half a second longer than necessary. Recognition without memory, perhaps, or something quieter. The guard did not react. After they passed, the corridor returned to stillness. He remained at post until relieved. At the end of the month, a sealed envelope appeared in his personnel file. He was informed of it without being shown the contents. That, too, was customary, a record of action, neither commendation nor reprimand, context. He accepted it without comment. The aide was never mentioned again. Her absence became part of the palace's background, like a corridor closed for renovation that no one remembered reopening. Authority redistributed itself smoothly. That redistribution mattered more than punishment. On his final shift of the week, the guard was posted briefly at the West Gallery during a maintenance inspection. The camera indicator glowed steady green. The floor pattern flowed uninterrupted toward the inner doors. The new guideline blended almost seamlessly now. He stood where he had stood before, weeks earlier, and felt no pull toward the memory. The place had returned to function. That was the point. When his relief arrived, he handed over with standard phrasing, no addenda, no warnings, nothing exceptional remained. He exited the palace as he always did, through the staff gate, past the stone that held the day's warmth longer than the air. Night had already settled beyond the walls. As he walked away, the palace behind him assumed its quiet dominance, unchanged in appearance, altered in detail. Systems corrected, boundaries reinforced, silence restored. The guard did not look back. His role had never been to be remembered, only to be present when it mattered.